My name is Tani Schwartz-Herman, and I work in JTS's Department of Community Engagement. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program and for joining our study session, Racial Equity is Skin Deep, Exploring Bias in Our Texts. Before I introduce Heather Miller, I just wanted to go over a few quick logistical announcements. We'll have some time for Q&A during the session. You can use the raise hand feature for Q&A, and I think you should be able to unmute yourself when you're called on to ask your question. If you're having trouble finding the raise hand feature, please send me a chat and I can help you and I can call on you that way as well. The sources for our session will be screen shared, and we'll also share a link to the sources shortly in the chat. Pleased to introduce Heather Miller. Heather Miller is founder of The Multitudes, which offers educational resources and workshops to build race consciousness in the Jewish community. Heather is an educator and rabbinical student who's passionate about creating embracing spaces in both the religious and secular parts of her life. She is a committed and active lay leader, serving as president of her synagogue and working on committees and projects as a USCJ board member and a member of UJA Federation's Community Resource Cabinet. Heather currently works with the Jewish Education Project, Jews of Color Initiative, and JCC Association to help move this work forward in Jewish spaces. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Heather Miller.
Hi, thank you. And I am going to share my screen and get everything situated. I have two screens happening here, so just give me one moment as I get everyone recentered. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, and I hope that we will learn a lot together this evening. All right. Hold on, I see a chat. Okay, great. So the sources that you have in the chat, it is helpful if you need that for accessibility purposes. I will be sharing the ones that we need for this session up on the screen. When we had to pivot to virtual, it was just easy for me to just pull it right into my slides. So here we have implicit bias is defined as the attitudes towards people or the stereotypes we associate with them without our conscious awareness. Our biases determine our preferences for or aversion to people or groups of people. But have we ever stopped to think about where those biases might come from? Have you ever thought about where and how those seeds were planted in the first place? Likely not. In the course of our unpacking, we often delve into text studies about welcoming the stranger. And over the past couple of years, many communities have read books and articles and have invited guest speakers and attended countless webinars. A lot of that learning, however, keeps the information in an intellectual space, and rarely, unless you've taken my course or one like it, rarely does that force us to be introspective about how we might have contributed to the smog, as Dr. Beverly Tatum refers to it. We've started to realize that by focusing on the stranger, we've missed the multiracial composition of our Jewish community. So when I first embarked on this journey and decided to step out of the shadows and to the front of rooms like these, I was actually cautioned by a prominent Jewish leader that folks would look at me and think, what is this S word possibly going to have to say to me? In fact, I've had folks say that to me so many times that I've joked that I'm going to get a shirt that says, I'm the S word that lives up the block, just to name the elephant in the room. People see me, and they expect me to A, have a story, and B, tell them that story as if making them comfortable is the price of admission for me. even if that means revealing something that might be one of the most intimate parts of myself. I've even been sent the message from a rabbi, no less, that my children and I need to expect such treatment because that's the price of looking like this in Jewish spaces. And while it may not have been intent to cause harm with that point of view, many of us have begun to parse out the intent versus impact dichotomy. And just now, I happen to see just a couple of your incredulous looks at what I just said. But I think that deep down, you know that this is a commonly held viewpoint in our larger Jewish community. I'm very relational, so I'm going to tell you a story. This is me, either this way or this way, whichever it is on your screen. This is me on my birthday a couple of years ago, and I wore this to work. It was not connected at all to my birthday, but it was connected to a theme day that we were doing for Autism Awareness Month. It was connected to acknowledging the sensory needs that our students often have. And this outfit was also one that I never got to wear for pajama day, ironically, because of a COVID closure. So it was a twofer. So in the middle of my day, I got a call that the books for my shul's Hebrew school were not going to be ready at 12 like they were supposed to be. They would be ready by 3. Had they been ready at noon, the executive director would have gone over and picked them up, but at 3, I'd have to, and then rush them over to the building in time for the start of school. The problem is that I looked like this. And the place that held those books was deep in the heart of Crown Heights. So if you're not familiar with Crown Heights, that is a very particular Jewish neighborhood. So as I can see the expressions on your faces, so you might be able to guess where this story might be going. So upon hanging up the phone, I was in full-blown panic. It was a Friday, and the store officially closed at 2 o'clock for Shabbat. So they sent me the code for the door. I ran every conceivable scenario in my brain about 1,000 times on how I could make this errand go seamlessly. I picked up my kids on the way. I made sure my day school kid came with me, kippah firmly in place. I thought that the streets would be sparsely populated because everybody would be home prepping for Shabbat. But as I rounded the corner, I saw that this storefront happened to be next to a grocery store with many last-minute shoppers. And my heart went into overdrive. I had to keep my wits about me, though, because I had to find a door I'd never been to, and I had to navigate the Shabbat lock. And if you've ever used one of those, you know that they are not all created equal. During my anxious searching, I definitely walked into the wrong building looking for a black bag with my name on it. And I was furiously texting the owner for directions, and I finally found the right door. I entered the code, nada. I tried again, nothing. I FaceTimed every Jew I knew who I thought might possibly have the requisite Shabbat lock experience that I needed. I even watched YouTube videos in the middle of the sidewalk. I struggled, my heart was racing, I was drenched with sweat, looking like this and looking like this in front of that door. I even cut my hand trying to get this thing open. And all I could think of was, do not get arrested on your birthday. And I played the 911 call over and over in my head. Crazy Black woman in a rainbow unicorn onesie trying to break into a bookstore. And what you cannot see in this picture is that it even has a tail. Eventually, I cut my losses and I gave up, and I decided that my white executive director, she could try again on Monday. And it turns out that the lock actually was broken. And so my confidence in my ability to open the door was restored. So now, you're probably asking yourselves, why am I telling you this story? But did you notice how all of you had the same reactions to my fear that someone might call the cops on me? You all knew that while this scene must have been hilarious to watch, my fear was very real. Why? Because the wider Jewish community has been conditioned to fear people who look like me, to see me as a stranger, an other, at best for my shik's appeal, but never to consider that I too am a Jew, just like you. Implicit bias can sneak up on you when you least expect it to. So, on January 4th, 1861, Rabbi Morris Jacob Raphael gave a speech in defense of slavery at what is now the B'nai Jeshurun synagogue in Manhattan, New York. He used the Torah to justify his position that slavery should be upheld as an institution and that it was morally right to own slaves. He used our text to answer three key questions. How far back can the existence of slavery be traced? Is slavery a sin? And what should the quality of life for slaves be? We will not be unpacking that as a topic this evening, but what really gets me is how this played out. When I think about how many people attended this sermon on that day, my stomach turns. So many more people wanted to hear it that he delivered it again to a packed house of ticket holders a week later. His speech, Bible View of Slavery, was such a hit that it was published on the front pages of the New York Herald, the New York Evening Press. It was also printed and sold in pamphlets and reported on in the New York Times, and undoubtedly was spun into countless Devar Torahs across the country with this position upheld. Only two rabbis, Rabbi David Einhorn and Rabbi Michael Halpern, published rebuttals to Rabbi Raphael's words. They believe strongly that Rabbi Raphael's view should not be seen as the American Jewish position on slavery. They pleaded with Jews that, they pleaded with Jews that this was a time to take a stand and not let folks like Rabbi Raphael speak for the American Jewish people. When we think about how implicit bias is passed through the generations, this is how. We have to be honest about the ugly in our history so that we can really peel back the layers and start anew. We like to sit comfortably in the knowledge that 100 years after this speech was given, Rabbi Heschel and 19 other rabbis marched with Dr. King. We uphold the beauty of the solidarity in that moment, but we overlook, or maybe we don't know, the other side of the reality of that time. So take this photo, for example. What we celebrate is Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel side by side, unified in their liberation theology. But what we don't talk about is what's something that's in the background. In the background of this picture is a billboard of Tepper's department store. And the reality is that Saul Tepper was a member of the Selma Jewish community, and he was a vocal proponent of segregation. This historic moment in the foreground has allowed many to lead with this idea that standing up for racial justice is in our Jewish DNA. Yet, according to the Beyond the Count survey, a staggering 80% of Jews of color would say otherwise. We don't tell the story of how, like, if Facebook and Twitter existed back then, those rabbis would have been trolled by folks like Mr. Tepper, and that there would have been some who sought to cancel them. So what we're going to do together for the rest of our time together this evening is go all the way back into our texts and unpack some of the sources of our most deeply held biases towards melanin. So this is meant to be an interactive session. And so whilst it might be a little weird to do this and not the same format as some of the other groups, I really want us to study these texts in Chavruta as much as we can. Had we been in person, we would have been doing these in small groups in the room because I really do. I firmly believe that learning is done best, especially learning like this, is done best with others. So does anybody have any questions so far? Otherwise, I'm going to dive right in.
I had a question. What was the S word? Shiksa or Svatsa?
I'm not saying the S word, but it's the second one.
Okay. Okay.
Because to me, that S word is akin to the N word, and I don't say that word either.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
yes, it would be the second one. All right, let us step right in. So there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of references to pale, fair, white skin being perceived as a sign of beauty. So we're only going to look at a few. So if you are following along on your text sheet, this is where it will say round 1 up at the top, but we're also going to have them up on the screen.
I don't have any text sheets.
Well, that's okay. So there was a link that was put in the chat, and if you don't have it, it's fine because I'm going to put it up on the screen. And then it will be up on the site with the recording, and you'll be able to look at them and do further text study, which I totally encourage. It looks like it was shared again in the text, in the chat. So here we have this intro text, and for ease, for equity here, I will read it in English. So it says, Reish Lakish says, a man who is tall should not marry a woman who is also tall, lest there emerge from them a child who is extremely tall. Similarly, a man who is a dwarf should not marry a woman who is also a dwarf, lest there emerge from them a child who is exceptionally short. A man whose skin is pale should not marry a woman whose skin is also pale, lest there emerge from them a child who is extremely pale. Likewise, a man whose skin is dark should not marry a woman whose skin is also dark, lest there emerge from them a child who is extremely dark. So now it's worth it to note that in the extremes of these descriptions here, those folks would also, should they be male children, and we can assume that they're talking about male children here, they would be exempt from temple service also. So what we see here is that there definitely is bias against folks who might stand out in some way, whether they be too tall, whether they be too short, extremely pale, or too dark. So what we're going to do as we dive into these texts is I'm going to be asking the same questions. We're going to hold, I want you to hold this idea of intent versus impact. Try to see these texts as if you are seeing them from the first time. Sometimes I tell my students, let's pretend that you are from Jupiter and you have just plopped down for the first time, and this is the first time you have heard this. And for some of these texts, it may very well be the first times you have heard them, or at least not looked at them like this. So what we're going to be looking at is what might stand out to you and what message might be sent or received. Okay, so let's look at the first one. So here we have from Genesis 12:11. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. So that's what the text says. Harmless, it's fine. But Ibn Ezra had some commentary on this. And so so clearly they were sitting around and they were talking about like, what else might this text say? And so what Ibn Ezra has to say is that there were beautiful women. There were women as beautiful as Sarah in her native country, but in Egypt and the southern lands, there was none as beautiful. The reason for this is that people's appearance is shaped by the climate. So what message might be received? And I'm going to throw it out to you. What might that mean? that she was beautiful. He didn't notice it until he went to Egypt and saw women whose skin color was shaped by the climate. You can use the raise hand feature if you like. Alan.
So to me, this is saying, not directly, but it's very strongly implying that the Southern folks just are not as beautiful, presumably because there's more sun there, and therefore they're going to have darker skin.
Right? Yes, go there. Yes. Thank you. Does anyone come to a different conclusion here? All right, I see some heads shaking no. So exactly, it's like this idea that he never noticed how beautiful his wife was until he saw dark-skinned women in Egypt, which means that she's, and as this goes through, as you get into deeper text study, what you'll learn is that Sarah is actually considered one of the most beautiful women in the Torah. There's a short list of them. I want to say there's 7. She is the first one. And so if we see that this sign of beauty is her fair skin, that says a lot about the things that are encoded. All right, so let's turn up the heat a little bit. So here's one. It says it was related. So this is from Moed Katan. So we're using text from our entire tradition. This is from the Talmud. And so it says it was related that Rav Bevai had a daughter and he spread lime on her, limb by limb. So think about this for a second. We know what lime does now. All right. Which caused her hair to fall out and her skin to whiten. She became so beautiful that when marrying her off, he took 400 dinars for her. There was a certain Gentile in his neighborhood who also had a daughter and wanted to do this as well. Obviously, fetched another bride price. He spread her entire body with lime all at once, and she died. And so he blamed this rabbi for that. So you can continue to do this. You can continue to read that text. You have it also. But what stands out and what is the message here that the Talmud is sharing? Janet.
Well, I think the implication here is that hairless, pale women have got a better value on the bride market.
Yeah. Okay. Hairless, right? Hairless.
Hairless, pale women. What I'm affected for is the fact is that he's selling his daughter, which really upsets me. But that's a whole other issue.
Stay away from Yevamot. That is, if you do Daf Yomi, it's a very, very difficult one to get through. Yep. David.
Yes, I think some of it comes from some cultural, that perhaps pale-skinned women would, not be out in the fields working, and therefore they weren't, out in the fields working. They were more cultured, whatever. It comes back to some societies, I think years ago, perhaps decades ago, or some islands where women who were very overweight were desirable because it meant their families were rich enough to feed them enough food to get to that state. I mean, now in our society, we kind of look down on that, but in a time of scarcity, that came up.
Right. So values definitely change over time.
It wasn't necessarily racist or You know, it's just kind of a more socioeconomic.
Perhaps. Alan.
So I wanted to,
Oh, I was thinking other Alan, but go ahead, Alan L, and then Alan Minton.
okay, I'll make mine fast. I didn't know that beard causes your hair growth.
Neither did I.
Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Right. I would say that there are probably a lot of people for whom that does not work in 2022. Maybe there was a different kind of beer that they were drinking back then. Alan Minton.
Yes,
But I should say,
I would like to add that we've done a lot of traveling over the years, and I have noticed that in many cultures, not necessarily the biblical Jewish culture, or not only the biblical Jewish culture, but in many cultures, one sees a preference for lighter skinned individuals. I noticed that very strongly in India and Vietnam. And there are essentially no Jews in either of those countries. But it's very clear that females or women in those countries will do a great deal to lighten their skins. That apparently they feel that makes them more attractive to the men.
Right, and that is colorism is very strong all around the world in
Yes.
many different cultures, many societies, and it exists here too. In our own text, that it is clear that there is a bias towards pale skin. Ellen, I'm guessing Ellen.
Yeah, well, Ellen is here with me. I'm Ben Bornstein, and but this is my wife's laptop. Mine was slow to boot. But I felt a bit of compulsion to go back to part of your previous example, and then I will try to tie it into this as well. And that is, if we're looking actually at Breshit here in Lech Lecha, you know, chapter 12, verses 11 onward, you know, much of which we actually chant on Yom Kippur, you know, he wasn't just suddenly recognizing just how beautiful his wife was. It was that he knew that they were going to take him out. They were going to murder him because she was beautiful in everyone's eyes. Right. And there was very little. He was, quite frankly, and this is perhaps the point to take him to task on, that he was willing to say that they weren't married in order to save his own skin, and a bit of cowardice there as to you know, what might happen to her. In fact, with was it Fichol or to so on. But the bottom line is Avimelech. But the point is that he was terrified that they were gonna stab him in the back, because if they knew she was his wife, and he would be dead and she would be alive and off. So I'm not sure that it's quite fair to use this as an example of comparison, or as evidence that somehow suddenly her value or the physical attributes were suddenly recognized. As far as someone else's later attribution or insinuation of that, well, it's out of historic context and the context of the heat of the moment. And when you're fighting for your life, I don't know, there were enough problems. And we had a lot of problems with all of that society, but you know, we've come a long way. As far as this, I don't know, there are all sorts of off the beaten track elements. I'm sitting here with Brachot and looking at the original Steinsaltz, and you know, we can shake our heads over a lot of things. I have to just sum up with your initial presentation, which I was shaking my head and very chagrined. I, as a Vermonter, would suggest, and a couple generations in Vermont who were abolitionists, in fact, and quite active. And my father went down in the day, left his job to go down to march with Reverend Martin Luther King in Selma, and risked losing his job for doing that in Vermont. I got to tell you that it sounds very much, you know, the rabbi who wrote that pamphlet, and others who were in the South as well, supporting slavery or trying to fit in. You know, they were dead wrong and they were called out. And but it's kind of in our eyes, it would be like a New York thing. out of touch and they're so involved in their insular world that they don't really, all you needed to do, quite frankly, was to give me a call and I would have gone and picked up those books for you. But I'm just saying.
I appreciate your perspective. And I think that I can agree to a degree. I do understand. The point of the text is not whether or not Avram was right or wrong for doing that. And we all know that there's the context. We know that by and large, we wouldn't want to have lived in biblical times. But I would say that first time, fine. He did it a second time. So we're not going to unpack that, but there was a second time. And so they used it to his advantage. He leveraged her beauty the second time he did it. So while the first time he was in a foreign land and he wasn't exactly sure, he knew he knew that she was considered beautiful in a different way here, because it does reference that where they were from, she didn't like mark the radar, but as they were traveling through, they had left their homeland. It was identified that she was differently beautiful in the lands that they were in. And so the second time he leveraged her beauty in a different way. So what stood out for me, however, in this text was that, so this value is clear for lighter skin. And note that, the Talmud was compiled later on, but it was that the quest for that lighter skin, it was that one, darker skin was undesirable, and that measures were taken, like extreme measures, because we know what lye can do to a body right now, if you've watched any sort of gangster movies, if that's true, I don't know, but it's an asset. And so it was worth it to go through any length possible to lighten the skin, and that the perceived reward for that was that the lighter skin fetched a higher bride price. And so that is something to think about, that was a societal norm, but that the norm was that darker skin was not as desirable as lighter skin, and that through any length necessary, to the point where a non-Jew saw that this happened, saw that this dad got a higher bride price and tried it. Unfortunately, it was not successful and his daughter passed away. So now, I'm going to move into the next set of texts so that we can do this. I'm so glad that we are nice and warmed up for the next group. So this will be round 2 in the section, if you're following along on the source sheet that you have. So I took a class a couple of years ago. In my bio, it does say that I am currently a rabbinical student. So a couple of years ago, I took a class and I heard the curse of Ham as if I had heard it for the first time. And so I sat there and wondered, does my son learn this at school? Like, it was like, I was stopped. I couldn't even pay attention to the class at that point. I said, how do they teach this with him in the room? And how did they teach it before he was in the room? And I wondered whether he heard the text the same way that I did. So we're going to unpack that one. This is going to be the last one that we talk about in this set. But that was actually the text that started me down this rabbit hole to find other examples of how our texts contribute to this idea of colorism, which a couple of you have pointed out already. So I've pulled out a couple of them. I really cannot wait to hear what messages you might glean from them. All right, so here, these are some of my favorites. So Song of Songs, we just read this recently. And so we have here, I am dark but comely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the pavilions of Solomon. So letting that rest for a second. We usually ask now when we have commentary, if you're doing text study in a Jewish educational space, you ask the question now, what's bothering Rashi? I think, really, what's wrong with Rashi? And so, just in case there was any confusion about what he interpreted this text to mean and what we're supposed to take out of it, it says, so, and in this portion where he's pulling out specifically, I am black but comely. Not even dark, black but comely. You, my friends, let me not be light in your eyes, even if my husband has left me because of my blackness, and we're going to come back to that later, for I am black because of the tanning of the sun. But I am comely with the shape of my beautiful limbs, though I am black like the tents of Kedar, which are blackened because of the rains, for they are always spread out in the wilderness. I am easily cleansed to become like the curtains of Shlomo. The allegory is, okay, so you can continue reading the rest on your own. But what is the message that is sent here? Janet.
I have a problem because my computer shut down, so I'm now on a different device.
You're
My
good.
sense, okay. My sense is that I was rather horrified by this. My sense is that Rashi has internalized early medieval European prejudice against dark skin and is adding things that were maybe not meant to be in the original.
But he is one of the greatest commentators. So
well, as I said, he was a person of his time, and I'm not really totally familiar with how prejudice against skin color would have spread in, what was he, 12th century France, or but I think it's more likely that it existed there than in the Middle East at some much earlier time.
Interesting. Okay. Anyone else? I will come back to that. Alan.
So I guess I'm a little puzzled that he's really focusing on suntan and asking the question as to whether it is conceivable, maybe, I don't know, that Rashi never met anyone who is naturally black.
Interesting. Okay. Vanessa. You are muted.
Figured that out. You pointed this out, but I'm fascinated by the fact that he changed the word dark to black. And that sort of jumped out at me because I'm not reading the text, and even if I was, I don't know I would catch it, but that's sort of just interesting that he changed it.
Right. I would say that Shahora probably would be closer to black.
And I appreciate that, but I'm fascinated that he changed the word.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that jumped out at me was an emphasis on the temporariness of the darker skin color, and that the message that Rashi is saying here is that because I have been out in the sun, my skin is dark like these wet, I'm picturing when khaki gets wet and the color changes to a darker thing, but don't worry, I have good features, I come from good stock, my people are good, because it goes on, it says I am black in my deeds, so sin, so black is also associated with sin in the rest of that, but I am comely by virtue of the deeds of my ancestors, so don't worry. My black is going to go away. I mean, okay, my black is not going away, but in this particular instance, the tan will fade and I will become as white as the curtains of Shlomo. So that's very interesting. Rachel, I saw your hands.
We were just trying to figure out where at what point in the story this was in terms of Sheba and Solomon.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Batya.
Is Rashi quoting something or is he making that up?
Well, so I'd have to look further in there. There are a couple of different references here. So one of them we are going to address because that first one does come from one of the other texts that we're going to look at. So he definitely is referencing different parts of the Torah as he is going through here. Usually the references are here. They're usually in the in there.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead. Ben? You were unmuted and now you're muted again.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm wondering if it's not somewhat allegorical. You know, Hebrew is in many ways, doesn't have the nuance that French would, that Rashi often wrote in, but you know, is it allegorical that when she's talking about her own blackness, it's and sins, that it's the darkness of maybe what she might have done in her with respect to actual deeds, and that her working, the whole business of working out in the field and being out in the wilderness is being out with a rough crowd. You know, that reminded somewhat of how the rabbis and Torah is always, I believe it's directly Torah, parents are admonished to teach their children certain fundamental things. And I know in their discussions in the Talmud that one doesn't set one's son or daughter up in business in an area that is well known for thievery and shysters, because you know, you're putting your kids at risk to be susceptible to those very that very corruption. So I'm wondering if it's a bit allegorical that what they're talking about, in fact, is, hey, yeah, I may have done something wrong, but hey, I can cleanse myself. Now, the reference to being darker as far as deeds and that language, fortunately, we've been able to begin to, and rightly so, to cleanse and to realign some of our language. But having spent some time in Japan and, you know, in the East as well, I see that, you know, people very, very much, women in particular, are very conscious about not exposing themselves to the sun, even in this day and age, about maintaining a very white and skin color and not and covering up in the bright sunlight. In fact, many people, even those who, shall we say, are doing field work, if they are ever called upon to do so, cover up tremendously. So it's there's definitely a cultural thing here that you know, we can look at it as bias. We can look at it as you know, tunnel in and direct it because we are Jews. We are all Jews, and we're looking at how it affects Jews and Jewish tradition. There's no question, but you know, is history, you know, are we seeing history from that ocean liner, from the one porthole in our little cabin and seeing just that porthole view of history, or are we seeing it from all the portholes of not just our ship, but all ships, that it's a continuum and not just the danger of seeing just one individual porthole view is that that's the only view we see, and it's selective and perhaps disorienting.
Thank you. Sabrina?
I'm going to keep my comment short. Navad does not mean comely. It means beautiful, pretty, pleasant, young woman. There's lots of things it means, but the comely and the way it is used in the current English is an inaccurate translation.
Thank you for pointing that out, because that's one of the things that stood out to me as well, because in our modern vernacular, the folks who translated this, comely is not a compliment. So that's very interesting that you pick that up as well.
Well,
so
it's
go ahead.
I've been teaching for a while, because it's like, if it's important that I think the commentate, it's worthy to hold that up against in terms of how it gets why was it translated that way to begin with, and why we have translators building on on the bias that that word implies. That's, you know.
Yep.
And now
Agree.
I'll shut up. Okay.
1000%. So we're going to move into the very next chapter because there's another example in Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 6. So here's another word. So don't stare at me because I am swarthy, because the sun has gazed upon me. My mother's sons quarreled with me. They made me guard the vineyards. My own vineyard I did not guard. And so Rashi again has commentary. And so he's picking up on a very similar thing. So he is pulling that out for, I want to say that it was Batya who pointed this out before. He does that again. And so he's pointing it out from that She'ani shechoret. So pulling that same out and translating that I am so black. For my blackness and my ugliness are not from my mother's womb, but from the sun's tanning. For that blackness can easily be whitened by staying in the shade. So if there was any wiggle room in the previous verse, the very next verse, his commentary is very explicit about what it is that he's talking about, and the connection, saying, I am tanned because of the sun, but that my skin can be easily whitened, and also that my blackness is not from my lineage. It is not from my mother's womb. It is from being outside, and that can change. So there is a heavy value placed, whether it is biblical, whether it is from the ancient Near East, or whether it is a value that is being placed from Rashi's time onto that. The value is very clear one way or another, that the person, that the speaker here wants to communicate that their ancestry does not contain that blackness. There's another, we'll not go into this one, but it is in your sheet. So it's the opposite from Lamentations, where the folks who are the elect being the people who are guarding her. So this is obviously, this is metaphorical, but saying that they were once purer than snow, whiter than milk, their limbs ruddier than coral. So regardless of whether this is metaphor, the value here is on the beauty in the pure white versus now their faces are blacker than soot. So, and that they are unrecognizable. So you have this sheet for further study. I do want to move on and talk about the last one because it brings these two together. And so this is the one. So this is the one that's really started me down this rabbit hole. And so we have this in Bereshit, chapter 8, verse 18. So Noah came out together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. So that is just what the text says. So now we have the commentary in a couple of different places. We have his Kuni and his commentary on it, and then the section that he's talking about from the Talmud that he references. So if you remember, if you're not as familiar with it, just recapping the story really quickly, Ham goes in after Noah has had a really long day. Perhaps he is passed out, whether he has had too much to drink, whatever, but his nakedness is revealed. Ham goes in, he sees his father's nakedness, and instead of doing what is perceived as the right thing and covering him, he goes out, he tells his brothers, and his brothers come in, they back into the room, they cover their father's nakedness, and then Ham is cursed for a couple of different reasons. So this also references that there might have been punishment because they were commanded to stay pure, not have sexual relations with each other, and it is implied here that perhaps he violated that rule as well. So there's a couple of reasons that he is being punished here. So that is what's here about the sexes not being able to join again. And so I've highlighted this part because he's being punished for violating the prohibition of sexual relations. And so there are three creatures that were punished here. It references the dog, the raven, and Ham. And so the punishment of Ham, however, is that his skin and the skin of his offspring was turned black. So that is what stands out? I'll take one. We have time for one in this particular section. What stands out? Punishable by black skin. Alan.
What stands out is that the penalty is your skin turns black.
Right. So what stands out for me is that very realization. But the thing that stopped me during the class when we were unpacking all of that is like, what does that say to people like me who are dark always? And what does that say to, and what message does that encode on folks who already have that pale skin about how they should see people who look like me? So if we're sitting in classes, so imagine, so just the way there is in just education at large, that there is a move to diversify the voices that we hear in English classes and all of those things across academia, so that we're centering voices of color, LGBTQI plus voices, women, all of those things, because we've realized that we've only really heard from the lens of a select group of folks in the syllabi that a lot of us grew up learning. What happens in our Jewish education when we're sitting and we're absorbing the messages in these texts, and then we're confronted one day, maybe my son is now sitting in somebody's class and they're reading this text like they always would, and then they're unpacking it, and then they're just like, wait, there's actually a brown person in this room. And what does that say? What does that encoding and what does that pause point say about how we have been learning these texts all along? And so I'm going to say that when we talk about implicit bias and the smog, so Dr. Beverly Tatum talks about the smog, and that's all of this bias and racism and classism, all of that stuff, it's in the air. We all breathe it. And until we really unpack it and we recognize that that is in the air that we breathe, we can't really do anything about it. And I will say that about a week and a half or so ago, my 4-year-old at dinner time told me that when he grows up, he's going to own a house and Black people will not be allowed inside. My heart stopped. What he meant now, so luckily my sister was there, and as my chin had already dropped onto the table, my sister was there to like step in, and so then we were able to explore what he meant. But what he meant was that he wouldn't let strangers or bad people in his house. So already he's not learning this in my house, but the smog that he is breathing is already teaching him that he's 4 years old, and it's already being imprinted on him that Black is associated with bad, with strangers, all of those things. So when we're thinking about why we should look at text in a different way and thinking of all of the ways we should expand our thinking around them, this is why, because it's already in the smog. So I have to end on a note of hope as we are about to wrap up this session together. And so despite the overall negative view of dark skin in our tradition, there are a few dark skin heroes that stand out. So we're only going to focus on one tonight. And we're going to also look at Sephora in a different way. And so that's going to make one of Rashi's comments before give it a little bit more context. So let's dive into these last texts. So I'm going to read this text from Me Yahoo. So it says, Ebed Melech, the Cushites, a eunuch who was in the king's palace, heard that they had put Yirmiyahu in the pit. The king was then sitting at the Benjamin gate. So Ebed Melech left the king's palace and spoke to the king. O Lord King, those men have acted wickedly in all they did to the prophet Yirmiyahu. They put him down in a pit to die there of hunger, for there was no more bread in the city. The king instructed Ebed Melech the Cushites, take with you 30 men from here and pull the prophet Yirmiyahu up out of the pit before he dies. So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went to the king's palace to a place below, the treasury. There they got worn cloths and rags, which they let down to Yirmiyahu in the pit by ropes. And Ebed-Melech, the Cushite, called to Yirmiyahu, put the worn cloths and rags under your armpits inside the ropes. Yirmiyahu did so, and they pulled Yirmiyahu up by the ropes and got him out of the pit, and Yirmiyahu remained in the prison compound. So here we have a situation where here's Ebed-Melech. He is a Cushite, which is associated with folks from Ethiopia. We know that he is a brown-skinned person. And one of the things that stands out to me is that not only would Yirmiyahu have died in that pit had it not been for the intervention of Ebed-Melech, he did so with care. So not only did he take him out of the pit, he stopped to get rags and he stopped to get those cloths so that as he was being hoisted out of this pit, he had padding so that he would not be harmed by the rope. And I think that it's really important to think about why the Torah is very intentional when it is naming folks. So we remember the women whose names are mentioned. The fact that this Cushite slave has a name and part of his story is mentioned, even if it is in relation to Yirmiyahu, I think that's a beautiful thing. And there's another verse here. We're short on time, so we won't unpack it the same way. But go in Yirmiyahu chapter 39, it says, go and say to Ebed-Melech. So God is talking to Yirmiyahu at this time. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I am going to fulfill my words concerning the city for disaster, not for good. And they shall come true on that day in your presence, but I will save you on that day, declares the Lord. You shall not be delivered into the hands of the men you dread. I will rescue you, and you shall not fall by sword. You shall escape with your life, because you trusted me, declares the Lord. So here we have, not only is Ebed-Melech, he has performed this role, he has made sure that Yirmiyahu was pulled out of the pit, did not die, but here God intervenes and gives him a prophecy. And so I think that is significant here. And last, we have this text that is being referenced by Rashi earlier on, where Miriam and Aharon are talking badly about Sephora, Moshe's wife, the Cushite woman. And here we are familiar with this verse. And that's the punishment to her by God, however, is to be afflicted, with white skin. But it says here, Rabbeinu Bahia says the reason Miriam spoke out was because Moses had married a black-skinned woman. Miriam thought that the reasons Moses had separated from Sephora was because he did not consider her attractive looking on account of the color of her skin. If Onkelos, another commentator, translates the word Cushite as beautiful, because there is a commentary there, there's a debate about what the Cushite means and whether it means beautiful or whether it does mean, whether it is more derogatory in that sense. This is not to be taken at face value because it's meant to save her from embarrassments. And it is similar to Avram, who did not become aware of Sarah's being physically attractive until they were at the boundary of Egypt. So they're making it very clear that that is the value here. And so the reason these, really, I'm going to stop sharing my screen actually, because we're about to end the session, but I hope that you will unpack these in a different way as you have copies of them. I really hope that you enjoyed just like at least seeing these texts in a different way. And I end with Sephora because I think that it is vitally important that we take a moment to ask ourselves whose value we're upholding. We saw that when Miriam spoke ill of Moshe's choice of wife, she was afflicted with a skin ailment that took away her skin color. I see that this might be a nod to the fact that Hashem does not support this colorism. And according to the Legend of the Jews, Volume 1, Chapter 2, Creation of Adam, if you want to look it up, the angel Gabriel was instructed to take dirt from all four corners of the world to create us so that no lands could reject us in our final burial. So there was green dirt, and there was black dirt, and there was red dirt, and there was white dirt, and it's all of us. And so I think that if we are to move forward, we have to consider that some of the biases we hold may go all the way back to the Torah, and that if we only learn them while sitting in the smog, we may be missing the messages that people like me hear that contribute to the mindsets that push so many of us to the fringes. I invite you to go down rabbit holes of your own and look, really look at these texts with equitable lenses. What messages do you see? How might others receive them, those messages? And what can we do to be like Rabbi Einhorn's and Rabbi Heschel's to ensure that we are working to make sure that all humans can really be free? So I thank you for learning. I will, and I look forward to chatting more during the panel in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I hope that everyone enjoyed their study sessions. We have a 10-minute break now, and our closing panel will begin at 7:50. And I'm opening the chat during our break, so you can feel free to chat with each other if you'd like.